Welcome back. We're joined again by Professor John Mearsheimer to discuss what's happening in Ukraine, Iran, and of course, US grand strategy in an increasingly confusing time. So thank you for coming back on, John. It's great to see you again.
You're welcome, Glenn. I'm glad to be back.
So I initially had intended a different topic, but as we see the bombing of Kiev last night, which according to the mayor, Klitschko, he argued this was the worst bombing of Kiev in the entire war. It begs the question, well, yeah, what does this mean? And also I've seen in other parts of the country, airfields being bombed, of military airfields, which again begs the question, why wait 4.5 years to go after these airfields? How are you assessing what the Russians are doing now?
Well, if you listen to a lot of the chatter surrounding this massive attack last night, it's seen as a reprisal for all of these drone attacks, these Ukrainian drone attacks into Russia. And the argument is that the Russians are getting tough now. When you hear that, and before you read about what the attacks looked like, you might think that what the Russians were going to do is go out and pound the civilian population, uh, launch what might be called a classic punishment campaign. But it seems quite clear that that's not the case, that the Russians went after military industrial targets, and they did not purposely attack civilians. According to the Kyiv Independent, 20 Ukrainians were killed. This is surely regrettable, but it's not a large number, and it does not represent a punishment campaign, a campaign designed to kill civilians. And what the Russians did was they launched a massive attack against, let's call them strategic targets. And they've done this in the past. There's not really that much new here. Yes, it was a massive attack, but as we know, there have been numerous occasions in the past where you've had massive attacks against military industrial targets. So I don't see how this could possibly represent a response to the drone attacks by the Ukrainians against the Russian heartland. It doesn't sort of add up to me. I think the Russians are probably going to spin it that way for public relations purposes to convince their Russian leaders will want to convince the domestic audience that they're responding to these drone attacks. But in reality, this is just what you would expect from the Russians and what we've seen from the Russians in terms of bombing campaigns. So that'd be my basic assessment of what's going on here.
Yeah, no, I know the media reports point to the larger killing of civilians, but as you said, in the past you would have like hundreds of drones and missiles, and you may have one or two deaths. This time it was more, relatively many more. But that being said, as you said, if you launch 500 missiles and drones, if the intention is to kill civilians, you're doing a very poor job. So it doesn't appear, as you said, this was a aim to, well, target civilians. Again, doesn't mean that the 20 deaths isn't horrible, but again, I think the context is important. But how do you see? Um, because many assume that when a retaliation comes from Russia, that it might not be restricted to Ukraine. Again, the Russians keep pointing to European production facilities as legitimate targets or any logistics centers. But it does beg the question, how involved is NATO here actually? Because this is something that's very much, well, often disputed. Although I'm not sure if you saw the news today, you had these two Russian pranksters. They had called the the advisor to the Estonian president, and essentially had him go on about how they had been offering coordinates in the attacks on St. Petersburg. This is quite significant. It would indicate, well, make it very clear that NATO countries are involved in the attacks on Russia. Indeed, Maria Zakharova said this, that this is evidence of Estonian participation in terrorist attacks on Russia. So again, how do you see this? Because this is widely contested, depending on where you get your news. But how involved do you see NATO being in these attacks?
Well, there's no question that NATO is deeply involved. And I'll talk about that in a second. But I would note if you look at the the declaration that came out after the G7 meeting in France. This was on June 17th when the declaration came out after the meetings were concluded. Uh, the G7 countries said that they were going to accelerate their support for the long range bombing campaign by Ukraine into Russia. This is really quite remarkable. They said they were going to accelerate it. And then furthermore, they said in this statement that was issued after the G7 meeting that they were going to ramp up the economic pressure on Russia. So if anybody in the Kremlin had any doubts about what the goals of the Europeans and the Americans are, they should have been dispelled as a result of what happened in France at this meeting. And by the way, it seems quite clear from what happened at this meeting that Trump was convinced that what the Ukrainians are doing is really quite impressive. And if anything, they should act more boldly. This has been widely reported in the Ukrainian press to be what Trump told Zelensky. So it looks like the United States is getting more involved these days than it has been over the past few months in putting military pressure on Ukraine. Excuse me, military pressure on Russia by the Ukrainians. Now, there's no question that we in the West have been providing all sorts of intelligence to the Ukrainians. And furthermore, supporting them by giving them drones and helping them develop their own drones. And I would imagine even helping them plan a number of the drone offensives that have taken place. And furthermore, as we well know, there have been all sorts of instances where Ukrainian drones flew over the Baltic states. And the Russians have not reacted to any of that. But they have made it clear that if any drones are launched from territory in the Baltic states, they will attack those launch sites. So that is, I think, at the moment, the most likely scenario for where you get a situation where Russia actually attacks a European, or to put it in more specific terms, a NATO member state. And I think for that reason, none of the Baltic states are willing to allow Ukraine to actually launch drones from their territory. But if that happens, I believe the Russians would axiomatically respond. They would be foolish not to. But let's assume that that's not going to happen. Then the question is, are the Russians going to retaliate at some point against Europe, given Europe's and America's assistance to the Ukrainians? Is it time for Russia to sort of throw down the gauntlet and actually attack targets in Eastern Europe? And this, of course, is the Sergei Karaganov argument, that the time has come to do that. And what we have to do, we meaning the Russians here, is we have to attack with conventional weapons first. And if that doesn't get the Europeans and the Americans to stop helping with this drone war, then we have to turn to the nuclear weapons. My view on this, Glenn, and I'd be curious what you think, is that the Russians won't do that right away. And I think there are sort of two reasons for that. One is, I think they believe that they can parry those drone attacks quite well. Now, that's not to say they'll be able to do that over the long term, because again, the G7 countries said they were going to accelerate their efforts to help Ukraine with this drone campaign. So it may reach the point where the Russians have no choice but to retaliate. But at this point, it looks like the Russians are doing a reasonably good job of parrying the attacks. And as long as that's the case, I think the incentives for the Russians to attack into Europe are reduced significantly. The other thing that I think really matters here is what happens on the battlefield. If you believe this rhetoric in the West that the Russians are stymied on the battlefield, and if anything, they're losing on the battlefield and they're suffering massive casualties, then you can spin out a story where it might make really good sense to pursue the Karaganov policy. Uh, but the fact is, that's not what's happening on the battlefield. The Russians are actually doing quite well. They're not winning a quick victory. There's no question about that. Uh, this is a steamroller that's moving quite slowly. But nevertheless, the Russians are moving toward conquering all of Donbass. They don't have much left to conquer before they control all of that real estate. So, given that the Russians are doing quite well on the battlefield, and given the fact that the Russians seem adept at parrying these drone attacks quite effectively, not perfectly, but quite effectively for the moment, I think the incentives for the Russians to go down the Karaganov road are not that great at the moment. Uh, but who knows how this is going to play itself out in the months ahead. So that's kind of how I see it. And I'd be curious to know what you think of my analysis.
No, I think that probably sounds correct. I mean, that's why I also have been a bit yeah, cautious about the way, or worried about the way many Western leaders talk about the need to bring war to Russia or increase the pain on Russia, because I think the main reason why Russia's been able to be restrained by not retaliating directly against any NATO country is exactly because the pain has been within the limit of being able to be absorbed, and without having significant impact. So essentially being these pinpricks. So then they essentially say, well, instead of going after the puppet masters within NATO, we'll just take and we'll destroy and defeat their proxy. And I think this has been the main approach by the Kremlin. The problem, which is why I'm very worried when the European leaders, now seemingly the Americans as well, are setting the objective of increasing the pain on Russia, is that luxury of simply absorbing the pain goes away, and then there's more pressure of doing some direct strikes and risking a major war with the West. And again, it's speculation, but this would make sense, because what else can Russia do then if it's no longer sustainable? The attacks was assisted by the West. What are they going to do? Are they going to are they going to stop the war, accept a ceasefire where the West begins to rearm Ukraine in preparation of another war? I mean, are they going to leave Ukraine and have NATO march in thereafter? This is all capitulation, which would be an existential threat. So if there is no peace, and the the Western escalations aren't sustainable anymore, that is, they can't absorb the pain, then I think they will, from their perspective, they would have to strike, um, yeah, Germany or the Baltic states, essentially putting the world at a new Cuban Missile Crisis. That is, either we go all out in war, or you guys back off. And I think this is often what would be required, or because often you see in human history, we do go all the way to the edge, and then once we face disaster, that's when this state leaders begin to change their minds. Again, I could be wrong, but one thing I did want to ask you, though, when you say at the G7, they come with these comments like, we have to accelerate the drone and missile attacks deep inside Russia. We saw NATO give some, or announce some $250,000 reward for strategies for targeting Russian airfields. Why are they so open now? I mean, they're less and less covert about this. Is this to normalize it, attacks on Russia, so the public won't be fearful of retaliation? Do they want a war? Is it to keep the US inside Europe by proving to the Americans there's nothing to fear? I mean, we could bomb the Kremlin tomorrow and the Russians would be too intimidated. It's just that the openness of the whole thing, it's very strange for me to see.
Well, I think, Glenn, the Western elites, and we're talking here mainly about the European elites, have convinced themselves that Putin is the devil incarnate, that Russia has grandiose ambitions, and that we in the West are destined uh, to fight a war with Russia at some point. Hard to say where. But for the time being, we're in an intense security competition. with the Russians. This is why we have to keep Ukraine intact. It's the battering ram. It's our principal weapon against the Russians while we're in the process of rearming for World War III. But you want to understand that that war is coming. It's just inevitable because Putin is he's this congenital aggressor, and he runs a country that has a rich history of aggression. So we really have no choice. Now, you and I both believe this argument is ludicrous, and I think ludicrous is an accurate word here. I don't understand where this story comes from, but that doesn't matter. They have been telling this story for so long now that I think they believe it. And I think that they have motivated there's all sorts of motivated biases at play here that you were talking about. If you want to convince your public to support increased defense spending, this story fits perfectly. If you want to keep the Americans in, this story fits perfectly. So it's not, I think, like these people are saying, what can we do to get the Americans in? What can we do, or to keep the Americans in? What can we do to keep or increase public support for our policies? And then they come up with this particular strategy. I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's much more unconscious. And I think it all revolves around the fact that if you tell yourself these stories long enough, you really come to believe them. I think you see this in the United States with regard to Iran. People have been talking about Iran as this incredibly dangerous threat for so long, even though it's not a threat to the United States in any meaningful way, that nevertheless the elites believe and most Americans believe. Uh, so, you and I have talked about this before. One of the downsides that we face of living in a world where facts and logic don't matter very much is that you end up in situations like the one that we face in Europe, where the Europeans, not the Russians, are talking about the inevitability of World War III. And the Russians are put in a position where they have come to conclude, well, if the Europeans think that war is inevitable and they're preparing for war against us, we have no choice but to prepare for that same war. And of course, once they do that, that provides ammunition for people in the West to say, oh, look at the Russians. They're the ones who are preparing for World War III. This is the classic security dilemma. Whatever the Russians do for defensive purposes looks offensive to people in the West, and vice versa. So we're in this spiral situation, which I don't see any way out of at this point in time. I mean, people like us try to talk sense in this discourse, but we're small voices compared to the mainstream media. That's the problem. So we have this situation where Western elites have convinced themselves that the Russians are truly dangerous and that we're heading for a major conflict down the road.
Yeah, this well, lack of logic. I keep seeing it everywhere. For one, the main argument now is that yeah, Ukraine is winning, and when they show towards the evidence, it's because the Russians are taking massive casualties and the Ukrainians are recapturing territory. But when you look at the reparation of remains or well, exchange of dead soldiers, you see often the ratio being like 1 to 20, even 1 to 40. It's a just huge amount of dead Ukrainian soldiers vis-a-vis relatively low numbers of Russian. And it doesn't really make any sense. I mean, if there are higher casualties, you would assume that they would be reversed. And you can make the argument that, well, it's if the Russians are moving forward, they're the one picking up the dead bodies. But again, they're also saying that Ukraine is capturing territory. So, but it doesn't make much sense, but they get away with it. And you also see the Putin is deeply rational. Yet at the same time, we feel comfortable participating in strikes against Russia, knowing that he will be restrained. And we know that Ukraine has to join NATO because otherwise, then Russia would never dare to attack it. But we're also saying that after Russia's done with Ukraine, it will attack NATO. None of these things adds up. And yeah, I even seen the German, I think it was Merz or von der Leyen, made the point that yeah, it was von der Leyen that Russia cut off Germany from gas. When all the record is there that it was the other way around. It's just it's like saying we have to continue the war to force Russia to negotiate. At the same time, it's the Europeans that refuse to pick up the phone and talk to the Russians for more than 4 years. It's very confusing to follow this kind of logic. That's what I meant when you said the Europeans seem to believe this as well as the Americans. But is this deliberate to push a long war, or do you just? I'm just wondering how much is ideological indoctrination and how much is deliberate strategy here.
Well, let's just talk a little bit about the casualty number or numbers. The New York Times had this piece on the relative balance of casualties. Casualties meaning killed in action plus wounded. And then they also had numbers of soldiers killed on both sides. And apparently, the New York Times article was based on a study that had been done by a think tank in Washington, D.C., the CSIS. And the argument was that roughly around 450,000 Russians had died, and somewhere between 125 and 150,000 Ukrainians had died. So let's take the high end number for the Ukrainians, which is 150,000. And again, the Russian number is 450,000. That's a 3-to-1 ratio. That means that 3 Russians have died for every Ukrainian. This is simply unbelievable. This cannot be the case. Uh, I don't understand where these numbers come from. Uh, First of all, the main killer on the battlefield is artillery, and throughout most of the war, the estimates are that the Russians have had at least a 5-to-1, if not a 7-to-1 or 10-to-1 advantage in artillery. If you look at these bombs, these smart bombs that are dropped from the air, the Russians have a huge inventory of smart bombs that they've been dropping on the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have virtually no smart bombs that they've been dropping on the Russians. You might say to yourself, well, it's the Russians who have mainly been on the offensive. Well, there's 2 problems there. One is that the Ukrainians have launched a large number of offensives. Remember the Kursk offensive? Remember the famous June 4th, 2023 offensive, the one that was going to result in a blitzkrieg that took the Ukrainians to the Sea of Azov and cut the Russian front lines in half? In 2022, the first year of the war, the Russians suffered 2 defeats because the Ukrainians launched major offensives in Kherson and Kharkiv. And then we hear about all these Ukrainian counterattacks these days. Those are offensive operations. So the Ukrainians have been on the offensive for a good part of the war, and therefore you can't make the argument that they've been on the defensive. And because the defense suffers less casualties than the offense does in almost all cases, we should not be surprised by that number that the New York Times uses. So you can't justify those numbers that way. It just makes no sense at all. And I think, if anything, that we're going to find out that the Ukrainians lost probably around, or have lost probably, and here when I say lost, I mean killed in action, around 1 million men. I think the argument that they've lost 150,000 is ludicrous. It just makes no sense at all. And nevertheless, this is reported as fact, and it is a set of facts. What I'm describing here is a set of facts that all sorts of people use to assess what the situation is between Russia and Ukraine and what we should do moving forward. And if you believe these numbers, which again I think are ridiculous, you can justify upping the ante and trying to help Ukraine really clobber the Russians and knock the Russians off as a great power, finish them off as a great power. And lots of people talk that way. And you just sort of say to yourself, are they making all of this up? Are they making these numbers up? Do you think the New York Times is making these numbers up? I don't think they're making them up. I think they really believe them. Again, there may be all sorts of motivated biases at play here that they are not aware of. But putting that aside, the fact is the elites have told themselves a story that they believe, and they continue to march forward based on these false narratives.
It's just I don't understand the political debates anymore in the West because, well, building on what you said, if you go, for example, back to the 2023 counteroffensive of the Ukrainians, it was evident from, well, pretty much the first day that this was going to end in disaster. And because the Russians had pulled back that from Kherson and Kharkov, they had to tighten up the defensive lines, and it looked as if the Ukrainians going to run into a brick wall. But I noticed as soon as we made or at least I made the point that this was going to end in disaster, this was kind of condemned as, well, why would you take wind out of, out of the sail of Ukraine? Like, of that, that's a pro-Russian thing to say. Of course, it's going to be success. You saw the same with Kursk. I mean, I think most people knew this was going to be a horrible disaster. Why would you leave your defensive position, go out in the open within hostile territory? And they were slaughtered in horrible numbers. Yet everyone had to fall in line and pretend as if this was a good idea. And yeah, you could say the same with the Nord Stream. Everyone had to go around pretending that this was Russian, and now we see this that everyone has to go and pretend that the Ukrainians are winning. We have to look away from all the available facts. It's just very strange that that this is where we are, where like objective reality doesn't have any value of its own. Everything seems to be only assessed by the extent to which you're applauding the right team. And if you're applauding the Ukrainians, then you have to pretend everything is a brilliant success and look away from the horrific defeats and horrible casualties. And otherwise, you're supporting the Russians. I mean, it's like we're watching a football game. This is pretty much where we are. It's very. Have you seen this before, or is this because there's a lot of commonality between many wars? And I know you shouldn't. Well, it's the same with the sanctions. If you say the sanctions aren't going to work, I noticed that from the first day as well. That was seen as being a pro-Russian statement because you undermine support in the sanctions. But are these, I mean, social constructivists who want to just elevate or make people support the wars, or is there something else to this? Because it's very hard to assess why reality means so little and why there's this obligated adherence to narratives.
Well, a couple of points. There's a very famous book entitled Truth is the First Casualty. And the argument is that when a war breaks out, because the propaganda machines on both sides immediately go to work, the end result is that truth gets washed out of the picture and propaganda becomes of enormous importance. The case I know best where you saw this was during the Vietnam War. Um, and some of it revolved around casualty counts, or what were then called body counts. And there was tremendous pressure put on the American military to inflate body counts because you really needed an indicator of success. The American public was saying, what kind of progress are we making here? What are the indicators that we're actually making progress? And of course, President Johnson and his lieutenants as well put pressure on the American military to indicate that we were, or give indicators that we were making great progress against the Viet Cong and the NVA. So body counts became the principal instrument for convincing the upper echelons of the Johnson administration and the public that we were winning the war. And you created this fantasy world where huge numbers of Vietnamese were dying, and therefore the storyline was that we were winning the war. And in fact, everybody who was involved in the process fully understood that we were acting in extremely dishonest ways for the purpose of satisfying the commanders who wanted to be able to make the case that we were winning. And if you look at a lot of the battles that took place during the war, we suffered enormous casualties. And in many of those cases, you could argue we won, but if we won, we barely won. But nevertheless, we described those battles as great victories. We went to great lengths to make it look like we were winning when we weren't winning. And this is why we lost the war. We were not making progress. If you actually look at what people like Johnson and others actually knew, and this even includes Westmoreland, what they actually knew about what was going on the battlefield from 65 on. Remember, we go in March 65 in a big way. They understood that we were in deep trouble. And despite the fact that they kept spinning these stories that we were doing well, that the body counts prove that, they understood at the same time that we were not doing well. And they were constantly searching for the magic formula, which they could never find and never did find. And therefore, we lost the war. But you just don't want to underestimate the extent to which a national security establishment, when it goes to war, will pursue propaganda in really extreme ways. Now, I think there are two big differences between the Vietnam situation and the present situation. One is that we've just gotten much more sophisticated at it. It's really quite amazing how good we are across the West. It's spinning out these stories that are really false narratives. We were not quite so good in the Vietnam War, right? We've gotten much better at it. The elites have really become quite skillful at propagandizing. And the second big difference is I think that during the Vietnam War, and this was evident in the comments I made a few minutes ago, while people were spinning positive stories, and this included people like Westmoreland and the military chiefs, and it included, of course, LBJ and his lieutenants. Well, they were spinning positive stories. At the same time, they knew that we were in deep trouble. They were aware of the fact that they were distorting the truth to keep support for the war in place. I think today, and this gets back to our earlier conversation, I think today most Western elites believe that we are actually doing very well in Ukraine and that the Ukrainians themselves are performing well on the battlefield, that the Russians have been at least stymied, uh, and maybe even the tide has turned. And furthermore, when you look at these Russian casualties, you look at the disastrous state of the Russian economy, you look at the fact that so many people are interested in overthrowing Putin. Really, all we have to do is just keep pushing and we're going to win a victory. It's going to happen. And people believe that. You and I think, again, that this is ludicrous, but we're a minority voice here. All sorts of people believe this in the West. And all of this tells you, by the way, Glenn, that the only thing that's going to dispel all these foolish notions about what's going on is a Russian victory on the battlefield. If the Russians roll up the Donbass, or once the Russians roll up the Donbass, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, and then they begin to move on to other oblasts, assuming they do that, then it'll be impossible to maintain this narrative. What enables people in the West to sustain this narrative is the slow progress of the Russian army. The fact is, the Russians have moved very slowly to roll up the Ukrainians. And by the way, to go back to the previous subject we were talking about, casualties, one of the reasons I believe these Russian casualty numbers are simply wrong is that the Russians uh, pursue their offensives in a very cautious way because they are interested in minimizing casualties. If you look carefully at Russian tactics on the battlefield and Russian strategy more generally, they go to enormous lengths to minimize the number of casualties. So this is a case where huge numbers of Russians are not dying in mindless frontal attacks that fail, as many in the West would like you to believe. The Russians are very cautious. They're suffering casualties for sure, especially because there are all those Ukrainian drones up in the sky. But the casualty numbers are not that high. And this, of course, is why that New York Times story is laughable.
Well, let me just ask one final question, though. If we take a few steps backwards to get, see a larger picture, how would you define the American grand strategy now at this point in history? That is, during the Cold War, the grand strategy with, one rival, one other center of power with one competing ideology. It was, the grand strategy of containment and all the other components. It set a clear goal, which kind of brought more or less the whole political class together. All other strategies were kind of had to be subordinated to this wider grand strategy. What is it today? Well, how is the United States dealing with the massive changes in the world and its own role in this world? That's a large question for, yeah, but
Well, I think when uh, me and my friends, or my friends and I, thought about grand strategy over the decades, we always used to argue that obviously the Western Hemisphere is the most important area of the world for the United States. But given that the United States is a regional hegemon, there's no serious threats in the Western Hemisphere. The question is, what are the areas outside of the United States that matter the most from a strategic point of view? Where are our vital interests at play around the world? And I think most people in my circle agreed that the three areas that mattered the most were Europe, East Asia, because there were great powers in Europe and East Asia, and the Persian Gulf, because oil was there. Those were the three key areas of the world outside of the Western Hemisphere. And during the Cold War, we focused mainly on Europe because the Soviet threat was centered in Europe. But the Soviet Union was, and Russia is, physically located in East Asia, as we both know. So we cared about containing the Soviets not just in Europe, but in East Asia as well. Uh, and the Persian Gulf was the area where we had to do the least amount of work. The British did the heavy lifting in the Gulf up until 1968. And then after 1968, up to 1979, we depended on the Iranians. This is under the Shah, the Saudis, and we didn't have any great threat. After 1979, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and there was the revolution in Iran, and Iran was no longer an ally, we built the Rapid Deployment Force, which was an over the horizon capability. In other words, we were not physically located with military forces, or we didn't have many military forces physically located in the Gulf. We had this Rapid Deployment Force, which again was over the horizon. So you see that during the Cold War, we cared about Europe, we cared about East Asia, and we cared about the Gulf. Uh, then comes the multipolar world that we're now in. And China is the principal threat to the United States, and therefore we pivoted to Asia. And there was a lot of talk about pivoting away from Europe and minimizing our commitment to the Gulf because we didn't see any great problem in the Gulf. We thought we had things under control. Uh, and with regard to the Western Hemisphere, you know, things were pretty good in the Western Hemisphere. No serious threats to the United States. Along comes the Trump administration, back into the White House, January 2025. Uh, what you see is that President Trump decides to make the Western Hemisphere a high priority, and we're deeply involved in social engineering and military engagement in the Western Hemisphere. If you look at what's happening in Venezuela, if you look at what's happening with regard to Cuba, if you look at President Trump's rhetoric about the Panama Canal, about Greenland, and making Canada the 51st state, the United States is paying a lot of attention to the Western Hemisphere, which kind of befuddles me because I don't think we face any serious threats at this point in time in the Western Hemisphere. But nevertheless, we are deeply involved in doing social engineering and even maybe acquiring territory in the Western Hemisphere. You want to remember that President Trump said at the time, when we captured President Maduro of Venezuela, that the United States now, or he now runs Venezuela, and that he basically viewed Venezuelan oil as American oil. It's really quite remarkable. So you can see that we're on the march in certain ways in the Western Hemisphere. With regard to the Gulf, we're now involved in a major conflict with Iran. It's really quite amazing. One can make the argument, Glenn, that we will eventually leave the Gulf, that we can no longer maintain military bases there. Our alliance structure is in tatters. That may happen. But for the time being, if you look at American grand strategy, we are up to our eyeballs in alligators in the Persian Gulf. And as I said, we're deeply involved in the Western Hemisphere. With regard to Ukraine and Europe, as we talked about earlier in the show, it appears that President Trump is more or less re-engaging in Ukraine, getting more deeply involved. And one could argue, Glenn, as the tide turns against Ukraine, which you and I know is happening as we speak, that the Russians will feel, excuse me, the Americans will feel compelled to move in and do everything possible to rescue Ukraine so as not to suffer a humiliating defeat. And then there's East Asia. That is what the Pentagon calls the pacing threat. So we're not leaving East Asia. And if you look at what the Chinese are likely to do over time and what the Americans are likely to do over time, that's a dangerous area of the world. I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years from now, or even 5 years from now, when you and I are talking about all the problems in the world, that China is not at the top of the list. Uh, so all of this is to say that the United States, under President Trump, has a remarkably ambitious grand strategy. Think about what I said about the Western Hemisphere. Think about where we are in the Gulf. Think about where we are vis-a-vis Ukraine, and think about the pacing threat, China. Uh, we don't seem to believe in the word prioritizing. The United States still labors under the illusion that it can be everywhere and do everything all the time. And I think that's where American grand strategy is at the moment. I think we could have a long conversation, and we should do this the next time we talk, or maybe do it the next time we talk, about where American grand strategy is headed. Once these various conflicts are behind us or they sort themselves out. And here we're talking about Ukraine uh, and uh, and Iran, and also to some extent places like Cuba and Greenland, then we can maybe get a clearer picture of American grand strategy. But I do think, Glenn, we, the United States, are going to have to learn to prioritize. I think this idea that, we can maintain this militarized state that's involved in really deep-seated ways in all four of these regions is not workable over the long term.
No, that's what I thought was the main challenge to the United States at this time in history, though, that is, as transition from unipolarity, where essentially has a final say in every corner of the world, to multipolarity. The grand strategy would have to include priorities. That is, you can't be everywhere, then what comes first? And this, I don't want to belittle the politicians. I think this is a difficult thing to adjust to once you had a political culture over decades of being everywhere at the same time and embracing an ideology which makes it almost treasonous and uncaring not to be everywhere, because all our wars is, of course, sold as being about helping the helping the disenfranchised and advancing liberal democracy. So it's very difficult to make this shift. But I thought that was the lesson from the Iran war, though. That is, if you can't have, I mean, when all the weapons had been spent in Ukraine, and then suddenly, how are we going to fight the Iranians? Then have to take the weapons from the Europeans, from the Ukrainians, from the East Asians, and send it all, not just to the Middle East, but Israel, because even the Gulf states were robbed of some of their air defenses. So I thought this was the main lesson. If you prioritize everything, you're not prioritizing anything at all. And but again, it could be huge shifts in the international distribution of power. It's usually destabilizing because politicians, they do need time to adjust to new realities, I think. Anyways, do you have any final thoughts before we end the video?
Yeah, let me make two quick points. One is the debt problem. Uh,
I
and
sorry to interrupt, but I always look at the debtclock.org, and I'm not even American. It's still depressing to me. It's a horrific number. So yeah, sorry. Go on.
no, no, you're right. It's you sort of think the chickens are going to come home to roost on that problem at some point in time. Second thing is, Glenn, if you look at the Ukraine war, and you think about fighting a war against China, or you think about fighting a war anywhere, what's very clear is that you need a large industrial base and you need the capability to produce huge numbers of weapons. Uh, I mean, again, just to go back to the Iran war, we had to quit after 40 days because we were basically running out of weaponry. It's truly amazing the extent to which we have run down our inventories of like Tomahawk missiles, Patriot missiles, THAAD missiles, air to ground smart bombs, and so forth and so on. Really quite amazing. And it's also quite amazing how long it's going to take us to rebuild those inventories, which have been whittled down. Um, and what this tells you is that we are going to have to prioritize. If you're going to plan for a war in Asia, right? And you're thinking about how you deal with the Chinese in a war over Taiwan or the South China Sea, a war that's going to go on for many months. Now, let's hope this never happens. I'm not saying this is likely or it's going to happen, but the Americans are going to have to prepare for a long war. This is what the Ukraine war has taught us. And we don't have the manufacturing base. When you look at how long it's going to take us to replenish our depleted stocks from the Iran war, it's really genuinely frightening from a security point of view. Really, it's quite amazing. So I think when you look at the debt problem and you look at the weakness of the American manufacturing base and the need to build uh, a large scale inventory of weapons and to have the ability to produce weapons once the conflict starts, we have a lot of work cut out for us. And that's going to involve prioritizing. So I think that the events that are now taking place, let me put it slightly differently. The events that have taken place since the Ukraine war started in 2022 up to the present day, this 5-year period is a period in which we have, or maybe it's a 4-year period, is a period in which we have learned a lot. And what we have learned should leave us deeply worried about our future. And when I say our, I'm talking here about the US.
Well, until next time, I hope to be able to discuss some more grand strategy with you because, yeah, the US has a fascinating history there. So, thank you so much for your time, and yeah, have a good one.
My pleasure, Glenn.